This is a walkthrough of in response to a video from my friend Jason Harmon over at his new API workshop YouTube channel, where he's doing several, hopefully a whole series of different helpful API 101 style videos that help people understand the world of API design. So mine's not going to be anywhere near as produced as his. I'm going to just do mine in one take and screenshot it and then publish it here to YouTube, kind of in response to his key value lesson on YouTube and how it applies to APIs.json vision. And you can find more on API Evangelist. I also have a story that I'm publishing in response. So his is REST API design, avoid future proofing with the JSON junk drawer. And I'm going to rename mine to be Bridging the Now to the Future by Defining the JSON Junk Drawer. So just kind of riffing off of his work here, which ties in pretty nicely. So you can read my post on API Evangelist to get the understanding of how he talks about key value stores and how we shouldn't use custom stores and rather make them first class citizens. So let's just jump into kind of what he was referencing is well, let's start with, well, what is apis.json? So basically apis.json is a JSON file, that a machine readable JSON file that lives in potentially in the root of a website. So you can go to apis.io/apis.json, and here's one in the root. You can go to apievangelist.com, apis.json. There's one in the root. And so what does this do? It let's explore the API Evangelist one. It allows me to describe my API. I give it a name. I give it a description, provide an image, some related tags, when it was created, modified, and the URL where it lives, and what version of the apis.json format it's currently using, which we're at 0.14, still really in its infancy, lots of changes ahead. And then basically it gives me a collection where I can describe one or many APIs. In this scenario, I've got one API here. And then at the bottom, there's a secondary collection, which we called include, but it's also a list of other APIs.json file that may be related to this site or collection. And then we have a maintainers collection, who's maintaining this APIs.json file using the vcard format. And as you can see, I'm the one responsible for this. So let's go back up to the actual APIs portion of this, because I think this is the part that Jason zoomed in on. And secondarily, it allows us to give each API its own name, its own description, image, and then a human URL, which points to a human landing page, a developer area where you can go find more information about this API, and then the base URL for the API, actually where you're making calls against this API. And then which the base URL acts as the unique identifier in this approach. We also allow for some tags, and then we all allow for a properties collection, which is a custom list of key value stores that allow you to reference different properties that are part of this API's definition. And I'll dive into more on that in a second. But then again, we also have another contact collection, which allows you to define separate specific contacts, again using the vcard, but more specifically for this API, because there may be many APIs here, and their actual contacts are different than the person maintaining this apis.json collection, because this may not be just one of these APIs that live in the root of either of these domains. It may be like a collection that we build, that allows you to, bring together multiple disparate APIs into a single collection. This one I've built, I call my utility stack, but it's, text extraction, keyword extraction, APIs that I use for basic kind of utility functions. And when you look deeper at some of the swagger that support some of these, you'll see they're actually other people's APIs. This one in particular is WordNix API. And so I'm able to bring together a collection of APIs rather than specifying, similar to sitemap.xml, what lives in the root of this site. So let's go back and zoom back into the properties for a specific API, because this is specifically what Jason was talking about. Is rather than having these properties be key value stores, separate type URL, that they should be brought out and become first class citizens, like base URL, human URL, or made into other collections like tags or and he specifically called out Swagger as one of this. We should have maybe a definitions collection with a specific value for Swagger in it, and allowing people to specify their Swagger. We also use Blueprint, RAML, Waddle. These are all in the APIs.json specification as key properties that you can use and reference for each API. And then we have, X dash, which represents custom, and allows you to basically name any property that you want. But the only ones that are accepted right now are Swagger, Blueprint, RAML, Waddle, because that was kind of the line with the first version that we wanted to get out the door. When Steve Wilmot from 3Scale and I defined, what should be contained for each API, we agreed on this, and then and contact info, and then from there, the properties really becomes the flexibility, allowing unlimited ability to define, uh, API operations, and if we were, so Jason's description of what you should be doing to make these first class citizens versus using key value store perfectly for me describes the APIs.json properties lifecycle, which basically allows everything starts as a custom X dash property. It can evolve towards an approved non X dash property, and then from there in future versions it can become actually baked into the API specification, allowing for you know easier referencing in your code, and just really more being baked into the overall format. And so let's take a look at how this would happen. So right now we have Swagger here as a property type, Swagger URL, and then in the future we would move that out of properties, and maybe we could add an entire whole definitions collection that would have Swagger as a core value. So you could then reference this as definitions.swagger, definitions.blueprint, simplifying your code as Jason suggested. And so that's the kind of end goal. I'm not saying this is what it's going to be, that it's going to be a collection, or this is going to be the actual format of that that's up to the group to decide on the APIs.json issue management on the repo. So we'll discuss that, and based upon how people are referencing definitions, we'll hopefully build that in. And so that's the evolution of definitions. But I have other aspirations that eventually API Commons, which now is just an X dash. This is another machine readable definition, but it's not approved yet. Eventually it could become a core property that we support, and then eventually it could come out entirely and be added under, we could have an entire licensing block, that collection that would allow you to specify you know uh, a Creative Commons, any sort of licensing for the interface itself, just the order, the rules for the interface, and then also separate licensing for the SDK, or if there's server code available, say it's an open source API, that you can have a third licensing for that, and basically come up with a more flexible way for specifying the licensing that better matches what the industry is actually doing. Right now, API Commons is kind of the first glimpse at that, but ultimately the community and usage will decide. I'm not, and again, I'm not saying this is what the collection will look like, but at some point we could have you know minimal properties, more definition and licensing based, that allows us to easily search at those. So that really represents, technical, the definitions, the surface area of these APIs in a machine readable way. The licensing, what I would consider, the politics of APIs, the legal side, and allows to actually make a decision based upon the licensing of the interface or of the server or client side code. And then, I have, beyond those technical and political interfaces, I have 138 other X properties that I've identified after looking at or generating 700 plus APIs.json file for the top APIs that I have out there, that I see out there and monitor on as part of my API stack, which 719 companies across 167 categories. These, after creating the APIs.json, which lives in all of these folders here, for each of these companies, I have a wealth of potential properties that we could track on, ranging from the technical to the business, the pricing, onboarding, communications. But these are all just, the API sector coming into focus for me personally. I'm not saying these are all going to be eventually baked into the core APIs.json format. Hence the, Jason's reference that I should be moving these up into you know core baked in first class properties or collections, which I agree with is something that applies very well in a if you're designing a new API, and you have the control over the API, that's the route you should be going. Zoom it out, when you're defining hundreds of APIs and that you don't have control over, you don't really have that freedom. So this life cycle represents, trying to make sense of that and understand, well, what are the common properties of APIs out there, and then how do we slowly over time formalize, a path forward, an evolutionary path, but rather than just based upon where we should be going, that's also based upon, what we have, aka the junk drawer that we have. And so, the future of this, out of these the 138 properties, I have some that are pricing related, monetization related, and say we took and we made, you know, we added in an X pricing, and this was, went to our pricing page in our developer area, and then eventually we made that into a machine readable format, and it became a standard pricing format, property that references a machine readable way of deciphering, how pricing is handled, for each API resource. And I've got a ways to go, but this is, one of the definitions I'm working on is how do you, similar to Swagger and Blueprint and RAML describing the interface, similar to API Commons providing a machine readable definition for the licensing. I would like to provide a machine readable blueprint for how we describe pricing, derived from John Musser's work around, common business models of APIs. And then eventually eventually, we would have our definitions collection, our licensing, and maybe some sort of a pricing collection that could break down, what units we're talking, what the price, what the volume, what currency, and how this fits into the overall service composition and pricing tiers. This is, again, this is not what I'm proposing a pricing collection should look like, but it shows you the evolution of APIs.json property from an X property to a ratified, approved property that's machine readable and a part of the APIs.json list of approved properties, and then all the way to a first class citizen as Jason recommends. But this again takes time. It's not just one API that's dictating what this JSON model looks like. It's looking across hundreds and potentially thousands, and then eventually millions of APIs, trying to understand this. And that's the evolution of this. And think of it when we can not just search the metadata, name, description, tags for an API. We can actually search against the actual technical interface for that API. We can actually search uh, across the pricing and the licensing for that API, and search for just the image API or the SMS API that fits our licensing needs, fits our technical interface needs, as well as being able to compare them based upon pricing for storage and other common units, like request, bandwidth, storage, different things that are slowly becoming commonplace across some slices of the API pie, like cloud computing. And so an APIs.json property, the power of this is that flexibility, that it can span the known all the way to the obscure and things that aren't fully common patterns or widely used, but maybe someday they will be, or with enough momentum in the industry they could be. So really this is about spanning the common to the obscure, the human to the machine readable, and across multiple providers. Swagger is done by WordNet. API Commons is done by API Evangelist and 3Scale. These formats in their evolution from an X property all the way to a fully baked in first class citizen, could be done by someone, an entirely third party that's not related to APIs.json. I wanted to allow for that flexibility, and that's the part that Steve and I envision this as a waiting room for standards, and I'm working with IEE and other groups to, what's that next step look like? What's that fourth step to actually making this into a ratified standard that goes beyond and transcends just APIs.json and actually goes further. So that's really the 100,000 foot vision of this, and why properties provide that flexibility, as long as you understand and know. And I agree with Jason 100%. When you're designing your APIs, using key value stores like this is a bad idea. But when you're trying to map out, the junk drawer that we have, and slowly sort it out and make sense out of it, and provide some real clear format, and guidelines and best practices for how people can operate their APIs. It takes a little different approach, and I'm assuming that most of you have a junk drawer in your house, and that doesn't make you a bad person. It's one of those things that eventually you want to evolve towards, where you kind of clean that out, organize it, and come up with logical places and ways of dealing with that junk, or get rid of it. You shouldn't even have it around. So it's all evolutionary process. It's just uh, you know the difference in how I look at the space, and I think a lot of technologists is, that are thankfully leading where we should be going, and the best practices of where we should be with our coding and our API design. But ultimately, my role, my self-appointed role, is to define, where we're at, and keep an eye on what those people are doing, and try to bridge that. And if that takes a little more overhead in writing some code and the search engines, and discovery tools and integration tools and mocking and testing and all the things that are popping up around machine readable API definitions, so be it. Hopefully, eventually those get baked in and become standards and formats and become a little bit easier to code against. And that's just some of the pain and suffering that we have to go through until these knowns are established, and we have a fully baked APIs.json format, which maybe is going to be a version one. Maybe by then it'll be a version two. We'll see, but hopefully it'll be fairly fast moving and based upon what people are actually doing.